I think that being hard on ourselves is so much of what gets in our way of creating good habits. Because the reason why we fall off is that if you've fallen off and then half the time once that happens, you are doubling down and going, "Oh, I'm so terrible." And then and the next day you're like, "Oh, it's even worse." And you're kind of like digging yourself into a hole, beating yourself up about how you have fallen off the boat and how you'll never return, and it's like you're creating that for yourself, right? And so I think that part of the reason why I've been able to stay consistent is my ability to pick myself back up again. Welcome to a Way of Thinking podcast. This podcast is dedicated to lighting the way towards greater inner peace and purpose. Hello and welcome to this episode of A Way of Thinking. I'm your host, Jessica Huang. And in this episode, we are celebrating. It is our 50th episode of A Way of Thinking, if you can believe it. And it's really unbelievable that we've made it this far. In case you didn't know, podcasts generally, there's this statistic that most podcasts don't make it past episode 8 or 9. And so it's definitely wild to me that we are still going even stronger, frankly, at episode 50. And so I'm so excited right now to share with you this excitement and just be in this moment of being at 50 episodes. And the podcast has been going on for 2 years now. And so I thought today we would talk a little bit about consistency. And I will definitely share a little bit about my experience of building this podcast, of staying consistent with the podcast. And I just think consistency is something that is so important in so many aspects of our lives. So that's the reason why I wanted to talk about it today. It was actually something someone had asked me about recently when I was saying how this podcast was at episode 50. And I actually had multiple people come to me and be like, "How did you do it? Like, how did you stay so consistent?" So I'll give you a little bit of a behind the scenes of what went into being consistent with this podcast and some of the lessons around that. And I think it's so important, especially as we're wanting to make changes in our lives, when we want to create something for ourselves. Consistency is such a powerful tool. And it's so very important because it's really the means in which that we create the life that we really want. There's this saying of we are what we repeatedly do. Excellence, therefore, is not an act, but a habit. And it's funny because actually, apparently that's quoted as Aristotle, but I read recently on the internet that it might not have been Aristotle, but regardless of that, it's a very powerful quote because it just reminds us it's all about the things that we're doing consistently. That is what really builds the life that we want for ourselves. It's the things that we are able to stay consistent with. So our habits are super powerful, and I will be talking a little bit about that today. And so before we get started, one thing, a quick announcement is that I'm actually starting up a newsletter, and I would love your help in making it feel a little bit less like I'm sending emails out to no one. So I would absolutely appreciate it if you could go and sign up for my newsletters. I will have a link in the show notes. So I decided to add a little bonus incentive. Anyone who listens to this between now and the end of August, this is 2024, is eligible for a free giveaway. So I will be doing a drawing, and whoever wins will get a free coaching session with me, a free 30-minute call with me, where we will coach on whatever it is that you need some help on to help you move forward in the path that you want to move in. So I decided to add a little extra bonus. So please go and sign up for my newsletter. And this will help you stay updated on the latest episodes of A Way of Thinking podcast. I will definitely be putting any announcements that I have going forward into these emails. So please, I would so appreciate if you can go and sign up. And I will be shooting out lots of fun things in there. So, again, if you sign up between now and August 31st, 2024, you will be eligible for this giveaway, and I will draw a name and someone will win a free coaching session. So, I am so excited to share another kind of format so I can help you guys along in your journey. Okay, so now let's dive into today's show. In this episode, we'll explore three simple yet powerful steps to help you create more consistency in your creativity and in your life. Now, let's get started. The first one that we want to talk about is this ability to make a good plan. And oftentimes, when we have this idea of like, I want to be more consistent, I want to be doing something more consistently, we have this tendency to kind of go very extreme, many of us, or we create these that we have this plan, but it's so much that it's overwhelming us, right? So one of the most important things is really creating a plan that is going to actually work for you. And what that looked like for me, so in terms of this podcast, is I remember when I first started, and I think that there was this idea that I weekly podcasts are the way to go, or if not, doing multiple times a week, which God bless people who are able to do that. Kudos to them. And so there was this kind of, I don't know, golden standard, I would say, of this idea that I was like, oh, in order to have a successful podcast, I need to be producing content every single week, consistently on the same day, and that's the way to do it. And I looked at that model, and especially at that time, I just really had to sit with the hard truth in myself, where I was going, I don't know if I could really be consistent if I tried to do that. And I think that this is where so many people can go wrong, right? Is just at that beginning stage of what they really want to accomplish and how they're setting themselves up. Are you setting yourself up for success? Are you choosing a plan that actually feels attainable to you? Because if we're setting plans that right from the get-go feels like too far of a stretch, and of course we want to be stretching ourselves as humans and doing things outside the box, but let's face it, like the thing that you're creating might already be a little bit of a stretch. And so it's like, how can you make it so that your plan for accomplishing this thing that you really want to do feels attainable? It's like you wanna stretch yourself just enough that you are pushing yourself, but not too far that it becomes this thing where you're like, "Oh god," and you're dreading it, or you're creating this feeling of every time you fall, you're just going to keep falling off the boat, and that is not going to serve you. So I think it's just so important to really sit with yourself and your inner wisdom and really like know yourself, right? Like really take a look at like what are my habits like right now? Like what would feel like a good stretch but not too far? And, for me, it was really starting this podcast that I'm going to do it bi-weekly, even though that's not the golden standard. In order for me to create consistency, that was what it needed to look like. And I'm really glad I did that because it's interesting. Like if I had really started this podcast at a weekly cadence, I may have been one of the many who falls off after episode 8 or 9, right? That easily could have happened to me because I would burn myself out. I would go too hard too fast and then fall off the boat and then not be able to get back on. But instead, I gave myself enough wiggle room to say, okay, like this feels like a good cadence that is manageable for me. And the important thing to note is that ability to say, I'm starting here and I can build up from there, right? So it's interesting. I've been playing around with the idea of like, what would it look like to get to weekly episodes? Like I'm doing that now, 2 weeks, 2 weeks, 2 years in. Right. And so it's not that this has to be a forever decision. And I think that that is so important. It's been really interesting even watching my mind play around with the idea of going to weekly podcasts because when I originally was thinking about it, I'm like, oh my God, I don't know if I can handle it. Like if I go weekly, then I have to do it for the rest of my life. It's like that's that kind of all or nothing mentality that we can trap ourselves in so often. And instead, I had to give myself that wiggle room to breathe and go, what if I just test it out? right? What if I just test out doing weekly podcasts for a month and see how it feels? And if it doesn't work, I go back to biweekly, and that's okay. Because the thing is, we're often judging ourselves so harshly in terms of that needing to be perfect, and which we'll get into more of this later. But the point is that you need to make it so that you're setting yourself up for success. You're stretching yourself a little bit out of your comfort zone, but you're also setting yourself up in a place where it feels possible, right? We don't want to be going so far where it's just like, I have no idea how I'm going to do this. Because let's face it, that also will keep you from even starting. And that is one of the biggest things that you want to remember is like you're creating this plan so you can start, so you can begin and feel okay and good about starting this process. Okay, so those are my thoughts around setting a good plan. And I think that it honestly is the most important step because we can get so caught up in the doing, and I want you to first go, well, is this even a good way to start this process for me? And make it and allow yourself, give yourself the permission to choose what will actually work for you. Because that's really the thing about it, right? When I was talking about that golden standard of the weekly podcast minimum, is that yes, that may be the golden standard, but I had to look at myself and the way that I worked and the fact that I was just starting this thing for that was totally different and new for me, and give myself the permission to be like, okay, for me, for the way that I am and the where I am right now in my life and how I want to go forward with this, biweekly is what is attainable and feels good. And gave myself that permission to feel good about that decision for myself. That's the first part is talking about this plan, and now let's move in to creating good habits. Oh, habits are challenging, right? Like there's so many great books and so much great thoughts around habits. And the thing is, it's so important to really be mindful of like creating these good habits so that they make things easier for you. So one thing around routines is like we tend to like to do things around the same time or the same day. So for instance, I tend to record these podcasts on Fridays because that is a day where I feel a little more relaxed and I'm able to give myself the space to be a little more creative. So I tend to like to record these that day. So again, this is a lot around paying attention to yourself, and this is something that I'm such a big advocate about is really paying attention to like your energy through the day, like when would it be a good time for you to do the thing that you're trying to do. So for me, for recording, it's like what day of the week, what time of the day does it feel like I have the right energy to be able to be more creative, to create this podcast. And so it's really important for you to pay attention to those things, right? For instance, I have a really hard time like doing something like this really late in the day because I am a little worn out. Like I like to be a little more energized when I am creating that. I think that comes through even when you're listening to my podcast. And so I'm very mindful of the fact that like I like to do this a little bit earlier in the day. I like to do it on a day when I'm feeling a little more creative. And so creating that space for yourself, like finding the times that really work for you and making it a routine is really important. And, I'm not recording every single Friday, but it's like I hold that space for myself to kind of do more creative tasks. And so my podcast kind of slots into that space. So for you in whatever creative endeavor you're doing, like when is the right time that it would feel good to do more of your creative work? Is it in the morning? Is it in the evening? What would feel right as far as like when you have that energy? For many of us, it's like, especially if you're still in a 9 to 5 job, it's like maybe in the evenings you are kind of spent and like tired and you want to just relax and it might not be your creative time. And maybe it's more of a morning thing that you do before you go to work. You spend 10, 15 minutes just doing something creative and giving yourself that time and space. For other people, it is more the evenings, right? The night owls out there. I've certainly been that type of person, right? Where it's like sometimes it's that the creative juices get going more in the evening. And so I think when we're building our habits, it's really important to pay attention to what is my energy like? Like, when do I feel kind of compelled to do this kind of thing? Because I think the thing is that we're often like kind of forcing our own hand. And it's like, how can we make these things easier for ourselves? And another great thing to note about routines and habits is I love the ability to do like habit stacking, right? The ability to go, all right, I'm already doing this similar task. And so I build this right after it, or I build it right before it, right? Well, usually after, I would say, right? So it's like I already am doing my meditation in the morning. And so right after my meditation, I go and draw. That could be an example. Or, it just being able to like kind of function it into a space where it's going to be routine, hence the word, right? Like it makes it easier. You want to be taking away the roadblocks that are making it feel like, oh, this feels like I'm forcing myself every single time. And so I think it's so important to find the ability to like make it easy. How can you make it easier for yourself to be creative, to or whatever the habit that you're trying to build, make it so that it's easy, where it feels like, oh, this is the most seamless place that it can go. And it will take some time for that habit to build. They say it takes like 30 days or whatever the case may be to really build up a good habit. But it's like, how can we reduce the friction? Because we're there's no point in fighting ourselves to do, especially when it's something you actually want to do. So it's like, how can you find the space to make it easy, seamless, and bring a little more fun to it? What would that be like? All right. So those are some of my thoughts around routines. I feel like I have many more thoughts, and I'm sure I'll share them in other episodes, but just some little tidbits, like finding that good time, finding that habit stacking is a great one. And trying to make it easy for yourself. Like, don't keep fighting ourselves on everything. And the last thing I want to say about having these good routines is that these are going to morph and shift over time. And the first one that you come up with might not be the best one. And so you might need to shift things around and move things around and play with it. And I think that's really important, because I think we think like, oh, this is where I think it should go and I'm going to do it. And then you're like, oh, but I keep having all these issues here and whatnot. Sometimes you have to like erase the plan that you made and create a new one. And so that ability to go, okay, if this routine is not working, I get to change it. So I want to invite you to give yourself permission to go, if I don't like the plan that I made, I can change it. I mentioned this in the last part too, but I want you to remember that, because I will tell you, like, along the way of me really creating better habits and routines around this podcast, which by the way, I am still working on it, right? Like, it is a constant work in progress for me of how to really create the best routines for this. But like, I find joy in the experimentation. I find joy in trying to figure it out and seeing what works and what doesn't work. So, how can you enjoy the process of figuring out what routines will work for you and what routines won't, and allow yourself the space to move and shift? So important. Okay, so now that we've covered off on creating a good plan and on creating good routines, the last step that I want to talk about is, how can we be perfectly imperfect? That's a good tongue twister. Okay, so this one, honestly, I think is so important, because let's be honest, I think that being hard on ourselves is so much of what gets in our way of creating good habits. Because the reason why we fall off is that if you've fallen off, and then half the time, once that happens, you are doubling down and going, "Oh, I'm so terrible." And then like, and the next day you're like, "Oh, it's even worse." And like you're kind of like digging yourself into a hole beating yourself up about how you have fallen off the boat and how you'll never return, and it's like you're creating that for yourself, right? And so I think that part of the reason why I've been able to stay consistent is my ability to like pick myself back up again. And my ability to forgive myself when I have fallen off. Clearly I have not literally posted every other week for the last 2 years. There's been moments where I have missed an episode here and there, or like I missed a week. And there's been so many moving parts and pieces and changes over the last 2 years that have gone behind the scenes of making this podcast happen. I've changed editors. I've changed so much of the setup. Today I'm using my camera instead of my iPhone and or my computer. Like there's so much happening, right? And so it's a lot of like allowing myself to not be perfect, to not, to say like, yes, I do like fundamentally believe I have been very consistent, and it's not been perfect. And I'm okay with that, right? And the faster that you can accept the fact that you've fallen off, the faster that you can get back on, right? And so it's going, okay, happened, move on, instead of letting yourself ruminate and judge yourself and criticize yourself and get that kind of that state of going like, "Oh, I'm bad," or "I've done a bad thing because like I can't stay consistent." It's like the more we beat up on ourselves, the less likely we are to get back on the horse. And so it's like, how can you, when you've fallen off, go, "It's okay. Let's try again." Right? And let go of the past. Right? It happened. We accept it. We forgive ourselves and we go, "Let's try again." And I think that that is so important to give ourselves that space, that room to breathe, that ability to go, and we'll try again, right? That is how we keep consistent. I can't stress it enough. The ability to forgive yourself every time that you fall off, because let's face it, life happens, things change, all kinds of things go wrong. And, it's okay. It's okay that we're not perfect. And as someone who has definitely been sitting with a lot of perfectionism, and I don't know if you feel the same way, but perfectionism is such a difficult thing, right? Because it just means how much we care. And I think that that's the thing, is like I've changed my relationship with my perfectionism. Like I know that it's there, and let's be honest, it comes up a lot. I see it pop up all the time. It's definitely something that I have, but I'm choosing to not be mad at it, and I'm choosing not to be upset with myself when my perfectionism comes up, but instead go, okay, I'm being a perfectionist because I care so much, because I want to do this well. And that's okay, but I am not going to let it keep getting in my way, right? And that's the thing, a lot of the times is like these things, like especially something like perfectionism, I don't know if I'm ever going to not be a perfectionist. Like it was funny, one of my coaches one time like called me out because I was like, "Oh, I'm a recovering perfectionist." And she was like, "Are you really?" And to be honest, I don't know. Probably not, right? Like I'm always going to have like a little bit of this. It's just my nature, right? It's this tendency. And my ability to go, it's okay that I am a perfectionist, and I just use it as information, right? And I use it and go, "Okay, I am being a perfectionist right now. I It is because I really care about what I'm doing and I want to do a good job, but I also have to give myself permission to do it imperfectly. Perfectly, I'm going to say it's backwards every time. Perfectly imperfect, right? I'm giving myself permission to be perfectly imperfect and just keep moving. Because the thing is, it's interesting. One of the things I was reading about the study, and it was this idea of like you had two groups of kids, and one group of kids, it was like they were every single day they were trying to draw the same thing every single day. And then another group was trying to draw the one thing perfectly. Like they were working on the same drawing for 30 days. And lo and behold, the group that was doing it like trying to draw that thing 30 times actually came out ahead of the one that was only making one drawing perfectly. And so it's so interesting, this kind of push and pull of quality over quantity. And in terms of consistency, or really in terms of growing and learning new skills, it really is more of a quantity game. I almost said that backwards. It's more of a quantity game than a quality game sometimes, right? Where it's like the way that we learn things is that we have to just keep trying. And, I look at this podcast, for instance, and it's like I had to overcome a lot of different challenges and overcome a lot of things that came up along the way of being consistent with this podcast. But by doing it, by keeping consistent, by making allowing myself to be perfectly imperfect, I have improved over time. And I look forward to continuing to improve over time. But it is that journey and that ability to go, I'm just going to keep doing it, and I'm not trying to make the perfect episode, and I'm just going to release it and just keep going. And it's interesting because yes, this specifically, the podcast has been such a good lesson in that ability to just be like, keep it going, keep releasing, like don't get hung up in it needing to be perfect. And just letting myself put out these episodes and move on to the next one and appreciate what I've done and move on to the next one, right? And keep going. So it is really important sometimes, especially when you're learning a new skill, especially or when you're trying to build new habits, to allow yourself to be perfectly imperfect and keep moving and focus on quantity over quality. So, I hope that this has been helpful. As we've discussed, it really is really creating that great plan for yourself and making sure that it feels like it's a little bit of a stretch but also feels attainable. And then secondly, making sure you're creating great routines and habits and allowing your habits to morph and shift over time, and really doing things perfectly imperfect. I'm gonna say that incorrectly over and over. See right here, we're just allowing that space, right? I'm allowing myself right now to be perfectly imperfect. So, I hope this is helpful. And again, if you are interested in, keeping up with the podcast and gaining some of these insights and making sure that you are moving yourself in the direction of that creative dream that you have for yourself, then I invite you to join my newsletter. Link is in the show notes. And by at the end of August, I will be pulling for a winner of the free coaching session. I am so excited to meet one of you and help you move in the direction of what you really want for yourself. This is it really is an honor to be able to help you. And, if you are someone that is feeling like this is that you want to create more creativity in your life and you want to be consistent with it and you want that support and help in moving in that direction, then please, I invite you to go and book a free call with me. And you can find that in the show notes or on my website. And I look forward to working with you and serving you. And I hope you're gaining so much amazing insight from these episodes. But it's been a delight, and I will see you on the next one.